It has been just over 100 years since the Hinterkaifeck murders, which took place in Bavaria, Germany in 1922, and remains unsolved to this day, with nobody having been brought to justice for the murder of the Gruber Gabriel family and their maid at the Hinterkaifeck farmstead. What makes this case so puzzling, as well as what happened before and after the murders, that makes absolutely no sense, and that is what we will explore and review in this video. Hey there little berries and newberries, Airy Berry here, hope you're all well. Welcome if you're new, welcome back if you are not. Before exploring the case of the Hinterkaifeck murders, I wish to thank the little berry subscribers, all 1,657 of you I think I've got right now, and also the channel members, whom I call my newberries, and thank you so much for your continued contribution and viewership. Alison Hempseed, Reality Check, Checking Convictions, Candy Ray and Alf. If you wish to support this channel and help me get closer to making this a full-time job, there is a link in the description or up above right now if you wish to become a channel member, which is £2.99 a month, for which I will give you a shout out as I've just done, and early access to videos, member only posts, member only videos. If you don't want to join as a member but would like to support me, then you can always donate as a one-off super thanks, but it's absolutely up to you, not compulsory at all. But subscribing doesn't cost anything, so if you would like to come back, click the button and it will be on your list and you can come back anytime you wish. Thank you very much. Now I want to start by giving these couple of disclaimers here. The Hinterkaifeck murders case involves the murder of children, sexual abuse and incest, as well as insinuations of stalking and mind games. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. As an additional note, several people in the story have the same first name, so efforts will be made to make sure we differentiate between who is who, and I apologise sincerely if I completely mispronounce any German names and places. I do apologise, please correct me in the comments if I get anything wrong. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was established in the early 1860s, and it was so called from a hamlet which lay about a kilometre south behind the woodlands called Kaifeck. The word Hinter in German means behind, so it literally means behind Kaifeck. The closest town was Schrobenhausen, and this whole place stood around 43 miles north of Munich. The Hinterkaifeck farm was in a kind of triangular plot of land, and the house itself was an L shape, which was comprised mostly of a single story, but also had a cellar and an attic. The shorter part of the L was a barn where hay and straw were stored and machinery, tools and equipment. There were about 3 compartments in that barn. One was more of the engine room and the other was a bit of a walkway between the two, and the other compartment was where hay and straw were kept. The longer part of the L was divided into half, and one area was the living quarters of the family and the other half was a stable where the livestock were kept. The shorter L was the barn, and there were several entrances. There was an external exit at the front of the property, which is the north gate, and that led to the main part of the barn where the hay and straw were kept. There was also a west gate, which was an entrance to the machine room, and also a south gate, which also gave an entrance to the machine room. There was an east gate, which gave an entrance to the walkway between the two sections of the barn. There was another door which led from the barn into the stables. This door was extremely narrow, it could only fit one person at a time. It led into the stable where chickens, pigs and cows were kept. There was another exit at the other end of the stable. The space between the two was the feeding aisle. The door opposite to the narrow one was just as narrow. That was the one that led into the living quarters of the house. This door opened up to an area that led to a very small kitchen, and some diagrams have shown that it had a staircase either down to the cellar or up to the attic, although I've not been able to confirm that. Directly opposite the door from the living quarters to the stable was the maid's chambers, which was also concealed behind a door. The kitchen was not self-contained, for it led directly to the hallway of the house, perpendicular to the kitchen, which in turn extended a bit further to the maid's chamber, making the kitchen and hallway area almost T-shaped. The front door was off the kitchen where people would approach to visit, and directly opposite that was the back entrance to the property, which led to the backyard where the well, shed and pastures lay. Along the long side of the T were 2 bedrooms, and more information about the occupants of those bedrooms will be given later. The outside shed had a bakery oven, so cooking was actually done outside of the house even if food was actually prepared inside. This was also where laundry was done, and some wood was kept for the fire. Hinterkaifeck was rather self-sufficient, which suited the reclusive family well that occupied the farm. Hinterkaifeck was so remote that the nearest neighbour lived about half a mile away, the Schlittenbauer family, who also ran a farm. Originally, Hinterkaifeck was owned by Johann Assam, who passed the title of the property to his son, Josef Assam, born on the 1st of August in 1852, and Josef's wife, Cecilia Sanhuter. She was born on the 27th of November in 1849, and upon their marriage on the 24th of April in 1877, as far as research can tell, they had 4 children. Their first, who's not been named, was stillborn and died on the 15th of December in 1877. Their next child, Martin Assam, was born on the 23rd of July in 1879. Then Cecilia Jr. and then Andreas were born on the 8th of February in 1881 and the 10th of July in 1883 respectively. Andreas died a few months after, so Josef and Cecilia had 2 surviving children. But on the 21st of May in 1885, when Cecilia was 35 years old, her 32-year-old husband Josef Assam contracted pneumonia and passed away. This meant that Cecilia inherited Hinterkaifeck from her husband. Upon their marriage, she received half the deeds anyway, but upon his death, she received the entire title. Cecilia kept the farm going and employed people to work for her. She couldn't do it herself. And one of the people who worked at Hinterkaifeck was Andreas Gruber, born on the 9th of November in 1858. He was 8.5 years Cecilia's junior. Less than a year after the death of Josef Assam, Cecilia and Andreas Gruber married on the 28th of December in 1885. And they continued to live at Hinterkaifeck, and upon their marriage, Andreas Gruber attained half of the deeds. So now it was the Gruber family. It was Andreas and Cecilia Gruber and the 2 children from Cecilia's first marriage. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber had 3 daughters. Only their oldest daughter, Victoria, actually survived to adulthood. She was born on the 6th of February in 1887. Their second daughter, Sophie, was born on the 15th of May in 1889 and died on the 26th of February in 1891. Reasons for that are unknown, and their third daughter died at birth on the 1st of August in 1892. Andreas Gruber was an excellent farmhand, and although he occasionally did work for neighbouring farms, he was not a pleasant individual. He was quite nasty to Cecilia. He really didn't make himself very well liked in Schrobenhausen, in the nearby town, and his stepchildren didn't particularly like him either. He was rumoured to be violent towards his wife and his children, and sometimes even he would withhold food from them. In 1902, Cecilia Assam, so the daughter from Cecilia now Gruber's first marriage, moved out, married her husband Josef Staringer, and as far as I know, they didn't return. Martin Assam remained at the farm with his half-sister Victoria. The Grubers ran Hinterkaifeck as normal, working the farm, also attending the church in the nearby town. But Andreas Gruber, as I said, was not a pleasant individual. He was an aggressive and antagonistic man. He was known again for being a very abusive family man, so people didn't really like him. Rumours spread through the village that Andreas and Cecilia's 2 younger daughters died from abuse and neglect, although that was never substantiated. Victoria was a brilliant farmhand herself, but she was much more sociable than the rest of her family. She went to church regularly. She sang lead in the choir. In addition to the rumours that spread through the village about Andreas Gruber abusing his wife and maybe having a hand in the deaths of 2 of his younger daughters, there were other rumours circulating about Andreas Gruber being inappropriate with his own daughter, Victoria. This was confirmed when Victoria was 16. She confided in the wife of a neighbouring farmer that her own father, Andreas Gruber, had been raping her regularly. It made her feel sick and so upset that she didn't know how to stop it. This incestuous relationship, and I really deign to call it a relationship, continued well into Victoria's adulthood. It is possible that she was so brainwashed and so coerced that she'd fallen victim to Stockholm Syndrome, essentially. She was a deft hand on the farm and she worked extremely hard. She had no other way of making a living and she was due to inherit the farm once she married. And she did on the 3rd of April in 1914 when she was 27 years old. She married 25-year-old Carl Gabriel. He was from quite a wealthy family, but Victoria didn't move away. As I said, she was due to inherit the farm. So Carl actually moved in with her and his now in-laws. As soon as Victoria and Carl married, ownership of the farm passed to them. To Victoria, went to Victoria and half went to Carl. They were given legal ownership of Hinterkaifeck, and Andreas and Cecilia, Victoria's parents, continued working and remaining there as occupants. Andreas strongly disliked Carl, likely out of jealousy because Carl could be with Victoria in a way that was legally approved in ways that Andreas could not. Andreas also withheld food from Carl, refusing to hand over the finances of the farm and having blazing rows with him. This harsh treatment caused Carl to go back to his parents after just a couple of weeks of marriage, but Carl's mother told him to go back and make it work with Victoria. As we all know, in 1914 what happened, the First World War broke out. And Carl enlisted in the army 4 months into his marriage to Victoria. And at the time he left, he was unaware that Victoria was pregnant. On the 12th of December in 1914, when Victoria was heavily pregnant, Carl Gabriel was declared dead, having been killed in action. His death was confirmed through testimony of the comrades that saw him dead, although his body was never actually found and recovered or returned to the family. The people who saw him dead said that he was buried in, I believe, a communal or a military grave in France. Again, that's never been confirmed. The newly widowed Victoria Gabriel gave birth to a baby girl on the 9th of January in 1915 and named the baby after her mother, Cecilia, although she was nicknamed Zilly. So this is how we will refer to her. When Zilly was born, 75% of Carl's share of the deeds to Hinterkaifeck farmstead were transferred to Zilly, with Victoria taking the remaining 25. Victoria could have remarried, but her father swore that Victoria would, quote, be his as long as he's alive. Martin Assam, Cecilia and Joseph Assam's son, remained at Hinterkaifeck until the age of 34, when he himself went to fight in the trenches. He had never married, and he passed away at the age of 37 in 1916 at a military hospital after being wounded on the battlefield. So the only surviving child from Cecilia Gruber's first marriage was her daughter, Cecilia Jr., who had now married and moved away. A few months after being widowed, Andreas Gruber and Victoria Gabriel were both convicted for incest that apparently occurred between 8 and 5 years prior. Andreas served 1 year in prison and returned to Hinterkaifeck upon his release. Some sources say that Victoria spent a month in prison, and some say she didn't spend any time in prison. It was a suspended sentence and she returned home. But either way, Victoria was accused of being party to the abuse that she suffered. At one point, Victoria became romantically involved with their closest neighbour, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who was widowed in 1918. Victoria proposed marriage to Lorenz, which he considered, but told Andreas Gruber that if he were to marry Victoria, that Andreas could no longer have a sexual relationship with his daughter, which Andreas did not promise to do. Lorenz and Victoria did not end up marrying because in September 1919, Victoria Gabriel gave birth to her second child, a little boy whom she called Joseph. However, she was widowed, unmarried, and truthfully, she didn't know who the father of the baby was, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, or her own father, Andreas Gruber. Many of the people in the town thought that to be the case, but it couldn't be proved. Lorenz was very upset about the arrival of the child, and as Victoria wanted Lorenz to claim paternity, with Lorenz initially refusing as he believed Joseph to be the product of incest. Lorenz then reported Andreas Gruber to the authorities once again for incest, but he dropped the charges after Victoria begged him to do so. The Gruber-Gabriel family were rather well off despite the financial burden the First World War had had on the mark, and Victoria Gabriel certainly didn't need child maintenance from Lorenz Schlittenbauer, but he was obliged to pay if he did claim paternity. If he didn't claim paternity, it would give more credence to the incest allegations. So in exchange for Lorenz dropping the allegations against Andreas Gruber, Victoria promised to repay him back any child support. Lorenz agreed, and his initials were placed on Joseph Gabriel's birth certificate. So Lorenz Schlittenbauer was legally Joseph Gabriel's father, yet he had very little to do with the little boy. The Gruber-Gabriel family were in fact so well off that they could afford to have a live-in maid, and in November 1920 they hired Crescens Rieger as their living maid. She didn't stay for very long, and she felt there was a presence in the house that she couldn't explain, which happened a couple of months leading up to September 1921. Crescens reported hearing footsteps and whispering coming from the attic on numerous occasions. The family thought she was either making it up or going crazy. In an interview with the police many years later, she said that every night at midnight, the door, she doesn't say which one, maybe her own door, would open on its own. Crescens felt that the house was haunted and was also upset by once walking into the barn and seeing Victoria and her father having sex. Victoria told Crescens that she did not know how to stop her father from having his way with her, and if she'd known that Crescens was about to walk in, Victoria would never have surrendered to him. It's unclear exactly what the catalyst was that drove Crescens away, but less than a year after her appointment, she left Hinterkaifeck. The Gruber-Gabriel family desperately needed a maid, partly for domestic running of the house. The family tended to the farm, but also for childcare. And Zilly, who was 6 or 7 years old at the time and attending school, she could be away during the day, but Joseph was only 2 years old. A few months after Crescens left, the Gruber-Gabriel family had still not found a replacement maid. And they had believed at first that the things that she was saying were, they weren't really happening. But as 1922 rolled around, the other occupants of the house, they started to hear things too. Some sounds coming from the attic, but each time they went up to investigate, there was nobody there. This remained the only occurrence, just the footsteps and the whispering. But leading up towards the end of March in 1922, they ramped up. The one and only set of keys to the property went missing and were never recovered. A Munich newspaper was found on the property, but nobody at the farm nor anyone in that vicinity or even in the nearby town subscribed to it. The postman didn't know anything about it. Food went missing. More strange noises, shuffling, voices, footsteps from the attic. On the 30th of March in 1922, Andreas Gruber reported to Lorenz Schlittenbauer that earlier that day he noticed a padlock on the engine room was broken. The engine room didn't show any other signs of damage, nothing had been taken, but the floor of the room showed that snow had been walked inside, and there were clear footprints in there. And he then had another look and saw the footprints were leading to the property from the woods behind. Some sources say it was one set, some say it was two. But the scary thing was these footprints only led to the house and not away. So he believed that whoever had done this had come from the woods into the house and had not left. Once again, Andreas conducted a search of the house, but once again he found nothing. Lorenz offered Andreas one of his firearms to protect himself and also offered to contact the police, but Andreas rejected both offers. He was reported to have boasted that he wasn't scared, he didn't want the police at his property, he'll handle it. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was not the only one to whom Andreas confided. Another neighbour said how Andreas had seen him in the fields, and as the two were chatting, Andreas relayed the same story. He was worried that someone or someones were hiding in his home, causing anxiety to the family, yet remaining elusive and avoiding discovery. How on earth were they doing this? There's only so many places someone can be in that house. Help was once again offered, which Andreas declined, and he said again he wasn't afraid. The same day, a cow had broken free from the stable and was running loose in the yard, although the cow had been tethered in the stable early that day and the stable had been locked. Victoria Gabriel was actually not at home that day on the 30th of March 1922. She was out in the town searching for a new maid, a position that the family really had trouble filling. It had been 6 months since Crescents had left. They really needed this new maid. Victoria was able to find 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner, and Maria agreed to take up the post and was due to arrive at Hinterkaifeck the very next day. That night, more sounds were heard in the attic. Andreas went up again and inspected it. As usual, nobody was there, but this time he noticed that hay and straw were scattered all over the floor in the attic. There wouldn't be any reason for hay and straw to be up there. The next day, Friday 31st of March in 1922, little Zilly fell asleep in class. Zilly was shaken awake by the teachers, who asked why she was so exhausted. Zilly began to tell them the story of the night before, but not that they were awakened by voices, but that her mother, Victoria Gabriel, had ran away from the farm in the night and ran into the woods. She was apparently upset after a very, very big fight with her father. The family feared she would end up falling into the river or possibly dying from exposure, so they were up all night searching for her. Eventually, she was actually found sitting on a tree stump, so she was okay, but everybody was up all night, so Zilly was really, really tired. Later that day, while Zilly was at school, Victoria and her father Andreas Gruber went into town, and this was when Andreas told someone else about the strange goings-on at the farm. He told a hardware store clerk. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid that Victoria had found the day before, arrived at Hinterkaifeck at around 5 p.m. with her sister Franziska. Franziska stayed at the farm with Maria to help her get settled in, but after Franziska left, Maria ran out of the house and gave her sister a huge hug, which was really unusual because these two sisters weren't particularly close. But Maria said that she felt that this farm, it was just so remote and so lonely. She felt that she would be there for so long before she'd see her sister again. But little did Franziska know that this would be the very last time she would ever see her sister. The next day was a Saturday. It was the 1st of April 1922, and Zilly was due to attend school because it was a 6-day-a-week school schedule. However, Zilly didn't attend. This was not unusual because Zilly was sometimes prone to illness, and she had been exhausted the day before, so the school didn't think anything of it. They assumed she was ill. This was not the only thing that was noticed. The farm was normally bustling of a weekend, cattle grazing, crops being attended to, chickens in the yard, pigs being fed, people tending to the farm. However, Hinterkaifeck was quiet. Very quiet. There was, however, some smoke coming from the chimney of the bakery in the tool shed. At about 5 p.m. on Saturday, the 1st of April 1922, a man walked past the farmstead and saw that there was indeed smoke coming from the chimney, and he could see that there was a fire lit inside, so it wasn't a case of a burnt out old meal that was still smoking. He could also see that there was somebody walking around in the yard holding a lantern, yet this man couldn't see who they were. He called out, and this person with the lantern approached him in a rather threatening manner, so the man left. He scarpered home. Over that weekend, more things were noticed that were odd. Some reports of animals making strange noises while being cooped up on the barn of the stables without being let out. It did concern some neighbours, but the noises weren't desperate or loud enough to be indications of distress amongst them. Farm animals make noise, and it seemed the same sort of thing, but it's odd that the animals weren't being let out to graze. Another passerby saw 2 people standing near the edge of the forest behind Hinterkaifeck, who were just standing there, seeming loitering or acting suspiciously. The passerby moved closer and the two figures turned around and ran into the woods. On the Monday, the 3rd of April 1922, the postman arrived and saw that mail from Saturday was still there, hadn't been collected since Saturday morning. The mail had been placed on the windowsill of the window in front of the house that looked onto the maid's chamber. On Tuesday, the 4th of April 1922, the school became more concerned because Zilly didn't attend the Monday or the Tuesday. In the morning of that Tuesday, an engine repairman called Albert Hofner arrived at Hinterkaifeck to repair an engine but could not get an answer. All of the doors of the property were locked. There was no sign of activity at all. Albert could hear the family dog barking from somewhere inside the house. He decided the family were out as all the livestock were locked away. He could hear some noises coming from the livestock, not much. But he did notice that the engine room, which is on the shorter part of the L, that wasn't locked, so he went in and got the engine out that he was due to repair, took it outside and repaired it. It took a few hours. As Albert was leaving, he saw that one of the barn doors was open and the dog was tied up outside, so there must have been someone home. Yet nobody had greeted Albert nor made their presence known. Albert went to the nearest neighbour, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and voiced his concern to Lorenz about the unusual activity, or lack thereof, on the farm. Additionally, 2 coffee merchants that were delivering a coffee order to Hinterkaifeck, and a few friends of Victoria who had gone to Hinterkaifeck on the Sunday to take it to church, reported to have just gone there and nobody was there. The whole place was locked up and quiet. After Albert Hofner had gone to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, he decided to take action. So he and 2 other people called Jacob Siegel and Michael Pell went to Hinterkaifeck to look it over and see what was going on. The property was indeed locked up, secured up. No animals were outside. They could hear the cattle inside, but the dog was no longer tethered outside. The dog was barking from inside. Yet the place was still locked up, apart from the door to the engine room. Via access to the engine room, the men decided that they would try and break into the property via that route. There was a door that led from the engine room to the barn, but that was secured with a beam on the other side. So the men had to really push this hard, and eventually it broke, and they were able to get into the barn. Lorenz and Michael went in, and they looked around with their torches, and Lorenz sort of found that there was some sort of wooden board on the floor. He climbed onto it and then over it. And then Michael cried out from behind him and he said, "There's a foot." Lorenz turned around and saw what Michael was pointing to. From under the piece of wood and hay that Lorenz had climbed over was a foot. The men pulled the foot from under the hay. They saw it was the body of Andreas Gruber. He'd suffered severe head trauma. The right side of his face had just been completely sliced. Underneath Andreas Gruber, they found the bodies of Cecilia Gruber, Victoria, and her daughter Zilly, who was only 7 years old. They had all suffered head trauma, severe cuts like massive blows to the side of the head, but there was no sign of little Joseph. And I'm not sure if Lorenz knew about the appointment of the maid, but she wasn't there either. Lorenz moved the bodies, much to the protest of Jacob, who urged him not to disturb this crime scene. The police had to be called and brought there straight away. But Lorenz answered that he was looking for his son. The cattle and the other animals were clearly hungry and making a lot of noise, so Lorenz asked one of the men to feed them while he searched the rest of the house. The bodies were situated in the barn next to the narrow door that led to the walkway adjacent to the stables. Lorenz, Jacob and Michael saw that there was a pickaxe in the stable that was propped up near the animals, and one of the cows was actually loose from its pen and just walking freely around the stable. The pickaxe was clean, and Lorenz deduced that the animals must have licked it clean and that this was the murder weapon. Lorenz went through the walkway of the stable and then through the other narrow door, which he found was unlocked. Lorenz then opened one of the internal doors to let the other people in. Jacob asked Lorenz how he managed to unlock the door because there was only one set of keys which had gone missing. And Lorenz said that the keys were in the lock of the door. The party went into the maid's chamber, and partially covered by a duvet was the body of Hinterkaifeck's newly appointed maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had the same type of injuries as the family. Lorenz and the other attendees noticed that there were drops and splashes of blood on the floor, but there weren't any bloody footprints. They searched the rest of the house and entered Victoria's bedroom that she shared with her son and daughter. Joseph Gabriel's pram was inside and was covered with one of Victoria's skirts. When the skirt was pulled off, it revealed that the cover of the pram had been punctured with an object so forcibly that it had plunged into the head of the 2-year-old little boy as he lay in his pram. Little Joseph was dead. Only the cattle, chickens, pigs, and the family dog had been spared. The dog was actually in the stable and was actually tethered in the stable. Some sources I've read say that his right eye had basically been gouged or been punctured, and some say he had an injury above his right eye. But he was noticeably scared when the men entered, so something had happened to him at some point. More importantly, he had been moved in a short space of time between Albert leaving Hinterkaifeck going to Lorenz Schlittenbauer and the party arriving at Hinterkaifeck within just a couple of hours. The police were called, and word got around very, very quickly to the neighbouring farmers in the town that there had been a family massacre at Hinterkaifeck. A huge crowd gathered. Lorenz Schlittenbauer stayed at Hinterkaifeck the whole time to keep an eye on the animals, but he also let random people into the property and almost gave a tour of the crime scene. As well as being a farm owner, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was also a tour guide for the town. That's how he had a second income. And it was like he was treating Hinterkaifeck just like another tour. He was warned by people to not let people in, but he said that, there's nothing he could do, they were here anyway. Yeah. One person even helped themselves to food in the kitchen. Nobody treated this like a crime scene until the police arrived. The police arrived from Munich in the early hours of the morning, but because it was so dark, they waited until daybreak the next day. They made a makeshift autopsy table using a door, and because Lorenz had moved the bodies, it had been difficult to determine in which order they had been killed or what the crime scene really looked like. In total, only 5 photographs were taken from the crime scene, and noticeably, no fingerprints were taken, even though that was standard practice and commonplace at the time. The autopsies that were carried out in full view of the townspeople concluded that all had died from blows to the head from a heavy instrument that had perforated their skulls, caused massive gashes and cuts, and blunt force trauma. So whatever this was partly sharp, partly blunt. It was a combination of penetrative wounds and the actual blunt force trauma of that weapon, whatever it was. The wounds were all on the right-hand side of the skulls, meaning that if they'd been facing their attacker, the attacker must have been left-handed. But if facing away, the attacker was right-handed. I'll come back to that. All victims were fully dressed. Victoria Gabriel and her mother Cecilia Gruber were all still in their day clothes, although little Zilly was in her nightgown. Andreas Gruber was dressed in an undershirt and trousers, so this indicated he was getting ready for bed, or in the process of getting ready for bed. Maria had one shoe on and one shoe off, and she also appeared to be in the process of getting ready for bed. The fact that the family were not seen after Friday, Zilly didn't go to school on Saturday, the mail was piling up from Saturday onwards, indicated that the family had died late in the evening of Friday the 31st of March 1922. When Victoria and Zilly's bodies were examined, they revealed additional details. Victoria had not only been hit in the head with a weapon thought to be a pickaxe, but she received so many more blows to her head, more blunt blows to her head than the others. There were several, quote, star-shaped wounds to her head. She'd also been strangled. Little Zilly, though, did not die instantly from her injuries. They determined that she'd been alive for a couple of hours, pulling out her hair in clumps, It was thought if she had received medical attention straight away, she would have survived. But without anything forthcoming, she passed away some hours later, and she must have suffered more than any of them did. The fact that Victoria was strangled was interesting because she was the only family member that had been. If the person who strangled her was the same person who struck the blows, it's more than likely that she was facing her attacker when she was struck, possibly adding credence to the person being left-handed. However, she could still have been struck from behind, and then she may have whipped around, knocked the weapon out of the hand of the perpetrator, only for them to resort to strangulation to finish her off. Possibly. It was believed then, and even believed to this day, that Victoria was the main one whom the killer wanted to target, because she was beaten so much more severely and she was the only one strangled. Strangulation is a very personal way of attacking and killing someone. It involves the victim and the killer being face to face, and the killer literally watching the life drain from the victim's eyes. The heads of the victims were taken to a Munich university for further examination, and the rest of the bodies were laid to rest in a communal plot a week later. Further examination of the crime scene found that Victoria's bedroom was a mess. Drawers had been opened, items thrown around the place, and some jewellery and watches, some of which were of quite a bit of value, hadn't been taken. A search of the attic took place, and what was found appeared to confirm Andreas Gruber's suspicions that someone was indeed inside the house. The attic had mounds of straw, some scattered across the floor, and the mounds showed indentations indicating that some people had been lying on them. Bacon rinds and human feces were also in the attic. There were 2 sections of roof tiles that were loose and easily removed, so seemed to indicate that the intruder had used these as points of a lookout so they could observe the outside of the home, or maybe even to signal to somebody else in the forest. Another conundrum was that because all the doors had been locked from within, then where was the killer? It's possible that they were still at the property when Lorenz, Jacob and Michael attended. All the doors were locked, except the door to the engine room, but in order to access the rest of the home from the engine room, there was another door which had a beam propped up on the inside. So where was the killer? It's possible they were still at the property when Lorenz, Jacob and Michael attended, and then made a getaway as soon as the exit door was available. Lorenz lied to the police. He said he blocked people from entering and exiting the farm, leading up to the police arrival, when he did just the opposite. But what was the motive? Was it money? Was it revenge? Love? Was it a thrill killing? It was rumoured that the family had several tens of thousands of marks in the house in cash, but the only note was a 5-mark bill, and the rest were around 20,000 marks in coins, as well as several valuables. But who massacres a family like this just to rob the place? You go in when they're not there, and you take what you want and you go. Or you go in there, you tie the family up, you scare them, you take the stuff and go. The fact that the cattle and the other animals weren't obviously starving, that food seemed to have gone missing even before that person ate something from the kitchen. The oven had clearly been lit and was smoking on the Saturday evening. The dog had been looked after and had moved around, as well as everything in the attic suggested that whoever killed the family stayed at the farm for a while, as well as the fact that there would have been no way out unless they were able to lock the doors from the outside without the key, which Lorenz said was inside, unless another set of keys had been made. Whoever it was at the farm felt that the best way to remain unseen was to stay at the farm and not leave until concerned people would come along and open the place up, and then they would have a window of opportunity to escape. This was later confirmed when the police were taking the bodies out of the barn. When taking Zeeley's body out, there was something different in there that wasn't in there just a few moments earlier. There were 2 entrances of which I could find to the attic. The hatches were accessible via a ladder, one was in the kitchen and one was in the barn. When the police were taking out little Zeeley, they saw that the hatch was open and there was a rope hanging down from a wooden beam above it. The wooden beam had quite a lot of dust on it and hand marks in the dust. That rope hadn't been there before. There had been someone in the attic all this time who had used the open doors and moments of people traipsing in and out as an opportunity to escape, and possibly just filtered straight into the crowd that were outside. The rope was likely their plan of escape, for jumping would cause an injury and a ladder would have been out of reach from above and would have caused noise. People would have noticed it. A rope is a lot more silent. They may have had some sort of means of concealing themselves inside the attic, which stopped Andreas Gruber from seeing them when he inspected the attic and when the police did the same. A thorough search of Hinterkaifeck, the surrounding fields and the woods took place, but there was no perpetrator found. How the murders were carried out was determined to be a case of each member of the family being lured one by one, not as a group, but one by one, from the main part of the house to the barn individually. The reasons for this is because experiments confirmed that no screaming from the barn could be heard from inside the house. If the person or persons who carried this out knew this, they knew to make sure that anyone in the house could not hear what was going on in the barn. If they were all lured in at once, some would have been able to flee, there would have been carnage all over the place, wounds would have been all over them and not just on one side of the head. It's possible that one of the adults could have tried to fight off the attacker, as they couldn't have attacked all at the same time with the same instruments simultaneously on the same sides of the head. The only blood spatter was on the door, the narrow door, from the barn to the stable, nowhere else. Inside the house, the maid's room was on the other side of the large L with no windows to the backyard. The two bedrooms were located towards the back of the property and overlooking the yard. It was speculated that the killer lured the family to the barn using the distraction of allowing one of the cows loose in the yard, as they were normally kept in the stable. This has some merit because Andreas Gruber kept a rifle and said it was always loaded just in case he caught the intruder. He had been tense because of the sounds going on in the attic. He always had his rifle ready. But this was not commotion coming from the attic. This was commotion coming from a stable involving one of the animals. A cow being loose either in the barn or the yard wouldn't have caused Andreas Gruber to grab his rifle. Dispatching the family using a heavy object with a protruding and pointed extension meant that the victims would have likely been rendered unconscious straight away, so that they couldn't have ran out screaming, or at least they would have been killed quickly. When the killer was done with Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria and Celie, they made their way into the house via the stable. They entered the bedroom of Maria Baumgartner and killed her the same way they'd killed the others. Maria Baumgartner was actually found curled up in a ball underneath her checkered duvet, but on top of the mattress of the bed that had been pulled onto the floor. This indicated that Maria had desperately tried to fight off her attacker, may have pulled the mattress off the bed by means of defending herself, but it was fruitless. The killer then made their way to Joseph Gabriel. They had to ensure that Maria was dead first, just in case she heard the killer as they entered the house and heard for Joseph if she fled or armed herself against the killer. They then dispatched 2-year-old Joseph lying helplessly in his pram with a single blow through the cover of the pram, then covering the pram with one of Victoria's skirts. The jewellery and watches and coins that were not taken did not rule out robbery, but certainly seemed that robbery was not the motive. Who would lie in wait, kill every member of a family, lock the place down, stay there for several days, not kill the animals or the family dog? I mean, what use are they to whoever it is? Or they felt the complete silence of the animals would arouse suspicion earlier. The jewellery and watches weren't taken likely because of weight, and if any of them were engraved or had any kind of mark or something that would identify to whom it belonged, that could trace whoever it is that may have tried to pawn them or even wear them back to the Grubers or the Gabriels. and they couldn't have anything that belonged to the Grubers and the Gabriels on them. And unfortunately, that also meant the children, they couldn't be taken either. It's likely the children were just collateral, and Maria was too. The coins would have weighed a bit, and notes are much easier to bundle together and carry. A reward of several 100,000 marks, which increased over time, was put up, but nobody has ever claimed it. Despite fingerprinting being a standard procedure, the police didn't do any. And this was subsequently criticised by future investigators into the case. The distant Gruber family and Carl Gabriel's family were involved in a legal battle over ownership of Hinterkaifeck. It was settled, though, when Carl's brothers purchased Hinterkaifeck from the Grubers for 2 million marks. And it was determined that these 2 million marks, were legitimately from Carl's brothers. They used their own money. It wasn't stolen, it was legitimate. A year after the murders, the farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck was demolished. During the demolition, the attic was once again searched, and people dismantling the property discovered something else in the attic that hadn't been noticed before. Near one of the hatches were some loose floorboards. Inside the cavity was a mattock, a very small axe, with a protruding nail at the handle near the blade, and more straw. There was also a metal hoop that had some dry blood stains. What this was, I'm not sure. When compared with the more superficial wounds on Victoria's skull, the protruding nail was found to be an exact match. So this item, the mattock, not the pickaxe, was the murder weapon. The pickaxe, it would seem, was either unintentionally or intentionally a red herring. In the barn, another item was found, a bloodied penknife. These discoveries could indicate a very sloppy and not so thorough search and investigation on part of the police. However, subsequent investigations confirmed that the police did do a thorough and meticulous search and investigation, although they didn't take fingerprints. The police defended their investigations, saying that they were thorough and any items found during demolition must have been placed after the police had left the property. So the perpetrator returned. If so, why? Did they know that the farm would be searched again? Did they know that the place was going to be demolished? Removing floorboards from the attic wouldn't have been something a new inhabitant would have done likely if this place had been occupied after the murders. The murders at Hinterkaifeck have never been solved, but there have been several suspects over the years. Lorenz was the townspeople's first choice, given that he was closest in proximity to Hinterkaifeck, his history with Victoria, and likely harboured a strong dislike for Andreas Gruber for his relationship with Victoria. Lorenz's odd behaviour when discovering the bodies, moving them, leading people around as if giving a tour, and then lying to the police, staying behind for the night, and it is possible that Lorenz already had in his possession either the missing key to the house or a duplicate key. If Lorenz had the key and had locked the house from the outside, keeping the key with him, and after breaking into the barn, he couldn't be seen with a key by Michael and Jacob and had to be seen to be breaking in with them, he was able to unlock the house from the inside. The key may have been in the lock, but nobody else saw the key in the lock, only Lorenz did, because he was the one that entered the property and then let everybody else in from that side. But it begs the question, why did he have to open the front door when everybody else already with him had access to the property via the barn? The key may well have been in the lock, but it is possible to lock a door from the outside using pliers or a similar tool when the keys are on the inside, but it does depend on the type of lock, so without knowing that, I don't know. It was Lorenz who decided to firstly search the inside of the home, and if he had the keys on him and wanted to make it seem that he couldn't have had the keys on him by saying they were in the lock before anyone could bear witness to whether the keys were actually in the lock or not, does seem suspicious. But one thing about Lorenz is that he ran his own farm. He was also the local tour guide. He was busy, so why on earth would he have the time to hide at Hinterkaifeck, without anyone noticing his absence. He's always denied being involved and said he was just trying to be helpful upon discovering the crime scene. Lorenz got so sick of people accusing him that he took legal action against anyone who slandered his name, even placing an article in the local paper threatening anyone accusing him with a lawsuit. Lorenz had not been charged or convicted, so it was absolutely right that the people's accusations were unfounded in law. The Schlittenbauers were treated like outsiders, and it affected them greatly. Even if Lorenz did do it, his family didn't deserve any ill treatment. No evidence has ever been uncovered to link Lorenz Schlittenbauer to the Hinterkaifeck murders, so this is just conjecture based on behaviour, so we should not be making claims when there's no basis. Lorenz was not the only suspect. There have been several others. At the time of the murders, only Cecilia Jr. from Cecilia Sr.'s first marriage was surviving at the time. She'd married and moved out 20 years prior, never declared as anyone as a person of interest, and certainly wasn't someone that the police looked into. Another suspect is a bit more mysterious. Carl Gabriel, Victoria's late husband. In the First World War, and indeed many others since and before, soldiers have sometimes been known to go AWOL during combat and disappear, only to assume new identities or go into hiding. Desertion is usually punishable by death, at least at this time it was. So the ones that go AWOL can never resume their old lives. It has been long speculated that Carl Gabriel was not killed in action. His body was never returned to the family or to Victoria, and no photographs, autopsy reports or anything else was produced, but he was declared dead. The police did speak with Carl's fellow soldiers who testified to seeing Carl's dead body and that he was buried in a military grave in France. He may have deserted the army, lived in hiding, and, upon hearing that Andreas was raping Victoria and that she'd fallen pregnant out of wedlock, may have enraged him to take revenge. And he may have even believed that little Zelie was not his. Zelie's father was always confirmed as Carl Gabriel because Victoria was married to him when she fell pregnant with Zelie. But it is possible that Zelie was not actually biologically his. Joseph certainly wasn't. Andreas Gruber had treated Carl Gabriel terribly, and Carl may have felt betrayed by his wife, and he certainly hated his father-in-law. So he may have gone back into hiding after or was being concealed by his family. But he was not the only member of the Gabriel family that was suspected. Carl's relatives were suspected too, for they tried to claim ownership of Hinterkaifeck from the evidence of the crime scene. Zelie owned half of the farm legally, and as she was the last one left alive, so she died after her mother, technically speaking, for the last hour or two of her life, she was the sole owner of Hinterkaifeck. A Gabriel was the owner of Hinterkaifeck. Therefore, the Gabriel family felt that the farm's ownership should go to them and not to the surviving Grubers. Ultimately, though, they purchased it from the Grubers and had the place demolished. No other property was built on the land. The only thing that remains there in one of the corners is a shrine to the 6 victims. It does seem suspicious that the Gabriels were so desperate to get their hands on Hinterkaifeck. Also, they ended up buying it from the extended Grubers. And for 2 million marks. That is not a small amount, especially at a time right after the First World War. But they didn't do anything with the farm. They didn't put it to any kind of good use. They just destroyed the house. If the perpetrator was not the Gabriels, why would the perpetrator have returned to the house to hide the murder weapon? This strange metal hoop and the penknife. Why didn't they just take them with them or destroy the evidence? Or did the Gabriels have Hinterkaifeck demolished because they knew the items were in there and they didn't want anyone else finding them? The people demolishing the house did find the items, but they were commissioned by the Gabriels to demolish the house. However, destroying a property at which a horrific crime took place is not unusual at all. And it's certainly not evidence of people carrying out the demolition as being guilty, but it does make me wonder why the land was left bare, and with the house gone, the land has lost its value. There were other suspects, as well as Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Carl Gabriel, and the Gabriels. Again, this is where we get onto where people have similar names, so I'm going to be very careful here to make sure I differentiate who they are. So the other suspects are the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump. They were known for their connections to a group called, I believe it's pronounced Freikorps Oberland, which is basically being suspected as being an extremist group. And one of the several things that were emerging in Germany between the two world wars were extremist groups. The Gump brothers' sister confessed on her deathbed that Anton and Adolf were the Hinterkaifeck murderers. This was in 1951, at which point Adolf had died. Anton Gump was arrested and investigated, but ultimately there was no evidence for him being involved in the crime. There were another pair of brothers who have been identified as Karl S. and Andreas S. A woman who has been identified as Teresa T. wrote a letter to the police in 1971. When she was 12, she saw a woman visit her mother, and this woman was the mother of Karl S. and Andrea S. She said her sons had committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. The woman to whom her mother was speaking said that her son Andreas had regretted he lost his penknife. The discovery of the penknife was not made public, so how could this piece of information be known? Still, it was one person saying that they heard one person saying that another person had committed the crime. The owner of the penknife couldn't be determined, but Crescence Rieger, the first maid, confirmed that she had seen a penknife at the property during her time there, so it could have just been one of the occupants. Another couple of brothers were named as suspects, Anton and Karl Bickler. They worked at Hinterkaifeck when Crescence was the maid. During her conversations with Anton Bickler, he said the family, quote, ought to be dead. What was interesting was that the family dog was a great watchdog and barked at everyone, including the family, but he never barked at Anton. Crescence, though, named another person whom she thought had committed the murders, assisted the Bickler brothers. I think it's pronounced Georg or George Siegel, who was another worker at the farm and was alleged to have burgled the house before. George admitted to having carved the mattock's handle and knew where this item would be normally kept. Our fourth pair of brothers now, the Thaler brothers. They were already known in the area as being criminals. They committed several burglaries, and one of the brothers, Joseph Thaler, had gone to the window of the former maid Crescence Rieger and asked her about the family, but she never divulged any information, so this person was trying to get some information. Still, Joseph Thaler knew about the house layout anyway, and that the family was rather wealthy. Another person was with Joseph at one point, both men staring at the engine room while looking up at the attic. The last person who we are going to name as a potential suspect, although there may be many others, is someone called Paul Müller. He was a German national who emigrated to the US for a certain period of time. He was suspected of many murders in the US, including a family from Massachusetts that bore many resemblances to the Hinterkaifeck murders. When Müller was close to being apprehended, he allegedly returned to Germany about 10 years prior to the Hinterkaifeck murders. To this day, the case of the Hinterkaifeck murders remains unsolved. One thing that hampered the investigation during the Second World War was that the university where the skulls of the victims were kept and other bits of evidence and documents, it was bombed, and much of the evidence was destroyed. The case was re-examined in 2007, so 85 years after the incident, by 15 students at a police academy in Fürstenfeldbruck. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And despite much of the evidence not being available, they did find quite a bit of evidence, and they used that to try and attempt to solve the case using what we would normally use as modern techniques. They concluded that although the investigation was thorough, the forensics was very, very poor. All 15 independently named one person as the prime suspect, but Out of respect for the victim's family, their remaining descendants, they haven't publicly named them. And I believe anyone who were to know this would have to sign an NDA because they can't risk this getting into the public domain. One thing I want to go back to, which I mentioned earlier, was the left-handedness issue. I don't actually think that's a point because a mattock, even though it's a small axe, is still difficult to wield with one hand. And I think if someone was going to be that ferocious with the weapon, they would use both hands. So why were most of the wounds, pretty much all the wounds, on this side? My thinking is, and a lot of people say that a cow was let loose in the yard and the family one by one were lured outside and then lured into the barn where they were killed. But if they were killed in the barn, it would have been in the engine room area and the person would have had to have dragged the bodies where they were, or why they didn't just leave. Well, they didn't leave them in there probably because they knew that the engine repairman was due to come in. And there was no blood there, no drag marks, no blood. They could have cleaned up, but it's highly unlikely that they would have done. In addition, the only blood spatter on the walls was on the door of the between the stable and the barn. If they had used the cow to lure the family out, more than one could have gone out at a time, and more than one could have been lured at the barn at a time, and the perpetrator couldn't have risked that. So I think one of two things happened. I think the family were lured to the barn via the narrow door from the kitchen, then to the barn. And as soon as they walked through, because the narrow door, there was no space on the left, only on the right. So as soon as they walk in, the right side of the face was here. The person was standing behind the door, had the axe, both hands, and used it to immediately dispatch whoever it was. So whoever it was probably wouldn't have screamed very much anyway, and that's probably why the blood spatter is on the door. That narrow door only allows one person at a time. I think that either that was when the killer decided to strike, or the killer wasn't actually... They either weren't planning to murder the family, at least not then at that point in that manner, but this was a crime of opportunity, or I've got to do it now, I'm never going to do this. Also bear in mind that Maria had only just arrived, so maybe they couldn't risk someone else becoming suspicious. So what may have happened is that the perpetrator may have come down into the barn for something. One of the family members, either Victoria or Cecilia, because they were fully dressed in their day clothes, somehow came through there, and the mattock was readily available. They thought, I've got to do this now. I can't let them see me. And go. And Victoria took a lot of beating to die, and she was actually hit with the handle a lot with the mattock as well. So this was a frenzied attack on Victoria, and she was strangled. And then it's likely that the perpetrator may have then used some sort of technique to lure more members there, or the members were thinking, why has everybody gone in there and not come out one by one? And it's possible that little Zelie was last, because her being on her own, her granddad or her grandma or mum would have said, stay there, and then she would have gone, what's going on? And then she would have been the last one there. Maria didn't come out, but that might have just been chance. I mean, she was in another room. She was getting, herself all settled and everything, and she wasn't that familiar with the layout of the property. She wouldn't have known exactly where sounds were coming from. So that's my thinking, that it's on the right-hand side, not because the person was left-handed, because doing something that ferociously, I wouldn't even use, I'm a right-handed person, and I wouldn't use just one arm to strike someone that many times. I'd use both. That's just what I think may have been the case. Do I think somebody was in there months before? Possibly, but I don't think they stayed. I think they may have been in there occasionally, or the sounds and everything were just an animal, rats, but I do think somebody was definitely living in the house about maybe 24 hours before, or even 2 days before. But what also I'm interested in is the fact that the padlock to the engine room had been broken. That was the only access to at least one of the rooms in the house. and the engine repairman was due to come along on the Tuesday. It's possible that the perpetrator knew that and knew that the engine repairman was going to turn up anyway, and that the engine repairman would have just gone into the barn, got what they need, repaired it and put it back, and there wouldn't be any need to have any other access to any other part of the house. And if the repairman had noticed that everything was locked down, they would have raised the alarm. And moving the dog would have given the impression to Albert Hoffner, the repairman, that someone was there, and he most likely would have left the farm saying nothing, buying them a bit more time. But why would the perpetrator go to so much trouble to make it obvious to the family that someone is stalking them? Because they knew that the family must have told some people, or they didn't think at all that they wouldn't say anything. The Munich newspaper, the footsteps, they would have known that it's snow, it's not safe or whatever, or they would have disguised their footprints by making it so there's loads of different footprints. I don't think there's really any way of solving this now, but it is an extremely interesting case, I have to say, and it's really tragic that I think as well the kids were killed, because Zelie would definitely have been able to identify whoever it was. 2-year-old Joseph, he was only 2, he wouldn't have been able to recognise anyone, but they couldn't have risked anyone finding out that Joseph was alive and well and with someone else and taking them with him, and they wouldn't have had any need or reason to take the boy. So unfortunately he died as well, and Maria was probably just collateral damage, which is very tragic that it happened on that day. But maybe the perpetrator realised that with Maria being there, they had to act immediately. So I will leave this case here for you. I'd love to hear your theories. Wishing you all the very, very best, my lovely little berries and newberries. Love you all. Bye.